This Labor Day at Lowe's, shop member-only doorbuster deals for a limited time. Save $50 on an Ego string trimmer, now $169. Plus, get 50% off select Holland pavers. Not a rewards member? Sign up for free today. But hurry, Labor Day doorbuster deals won't last long. Lowe's, we help, you save. Valid through 9/1 while supplies last. Program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
My, I am so out of practice. There is no rehab assignment when you're a podcaster. I guess someone else could have invited me on to their show to let me limber up a little bit. But now that I think about it, I might not have been up to doing it. Well, we'll get back to that in a minute. Let's start somewhere where we're all comfortable. That Casey Stengel, Hall of Fame manager of the Dodgers, Braves, Yankees, and Mets, was still working at age 75 in 1965. Was quite the accomplishment, given that the life expectancy of a man born in 1890 wasn't anything like 75 years old, never mind an active 75-year-old who not only had to fly all around the country every baseball season, but was an avid smoker and drinker as well. I always think of President Franklin Roosevelt, who was born in 1882, so 8 years before Casey, but died in 1945, 30 years before he did. Now, he had some famous comorbidities, obviously, so he's not the best example. He's just another flawed hero of mine, so easy for me to remember. How about some actors? Frank Morgan. You may not remember him by name, but he was a standby, particularly for MGM Pictures in the 40s and 50s. He was a leading man in the silent days, if I recall correctly. You might have seen him in the Lubitsch classic, The Shop Around the Corner, but hell, every American, I would think, has seen The Wizard of Oz, 1939. He played the wizard to Judy Garland's Dorothy. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. That was him. He was born 1890, died 1949, the same year Casey won his first World Series with the Yankees. Stan Laurel, the brains and half the talent behind Laurel and Hardy, born June 16th, 1890, died 1965, about a month before a broken hip finally forced Casey into retirement. Horror writer, bigot, and I am Providence, Rhode Island weirdo H.P. Lovecraft, born about a month after Casey, died in 1937, while Casey spent an enforced year off being paid by the Dodgers not to manage and looking after his oil investments. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike, born in Texas in 1890 but brought up in Abilene, Kansas, only about 150 miles from where Casey was growing up in Kansas City. Like Casey, he smoked all the cigarettes, and for a while he was subjected to probably more stress than any human has ever endured, trying to manage the coalition that won World War II. He checked out in 1969. Of the two other Hall of Fame ballplayers born in 1890, the outfielders Max Carey and Sam Rice, the former survived Casey by a little less than a year. He was also his predecessor with the Brooklyn Dodgers as manager. The other, Rice, predeceased him by the same amount of time. Now, that's not to say that Casey, the old man, didn't have any health problems even before the broken hip. And I'm not just talking about the uninsured driver who ran him down on a rainy day as he crossed or attempted to cross Boston's Kenmore Square during the war. Your attempt at suicide understood, wired his friend Frankie Frisch. Or the time in 1922, he was hit in the head by Cubs pitcher Virgil Cheeves, and as he remembered it, felt okay until after the game when he and some fellow Giants were in a speakeasy and he started coughing up blood. Then I did get scared, he said. And I said to Irish Musel, for heaven's sake, get me out of here because I do not wish to die in a saloon. So they helped me back to the hotel and I went to bed, and that's when they found out my skull was fractured. As May 1960 gave way to June, he felt off. That year would be both his last pennant and his last season with the Yankees. He was 70, which made him the oldest manager to take a team to the World Series to that point in time. And it seems like he almost didn't make it. He was perhaps suffering from some kind of hard-to-shake virus, which, I quote, settled in his kidneys. At his age, it could have been something dire, and so he was sent to the hospital. It took about 10 days for the thing to run its course. He went into the hospital about May 31st, was released roughly 6 days later, and after resting another couple of days at home, rejoined the team. It went 3-4 under his substitute Ralph Houck. Never mind that, though. What did the doctors say, Casey? They examined all my organs. Some of them are quite remarkable, and others are not so good. A lot of museums are bidding for them. That's how I have felt for the last 3 weeks, having just been through a similar experience. And so I am reminded not just of Casey's deflection as to his physical condition, which was bad enough that it might have kept him from taking the Detroit Tigers job in 1961 after he left the Yankees, but also his remark, after his long career had finally concluded, that if he had it to do all over again, he would not be a manager. He would choose to be an astronaut. Me too, Casey. And then we could, together or separately, aim our rocket at the Nope, that one is hiding Neverland. So make that third star to the right and blast off for the infinite inning. Well, hello there and welcome back to the show. Oh my goodness, welcome you back, welcome me back, welcome us all back, welcome the cat, the dog, the parakeet, whoever is with you watching this show, the wife, the child, the husband, the best friend, the orphan you found along the side of the road, the plucky orphan who you are now helping in their adventures to recover the fortune that was stolen from them by their late father's business partner. I said watching this podcast, didn't I? Watching it is entirely optional because there is no visual. There is only audio. I realize that makes us self-defeating in some way, but you really don't want to see me right now. If ever, my voice definitely sounds better than I look or I feel. I, in case you've forgotten, am Stephen Goldman, your convivial host for, as always, a mission to better understand the present via a trip to the past, the time machine being, for the most part, the game of baseball, a microcosm of the rest of our American world. And yes, it's been a while. I have been away. If you happen to hear the last reissue episode, or are in the Facebook group, or you are a Patreon supporter, then you likely saw my message that I was on the injured list. I had surgery 3 weeks ago today, and I was so naive about this procedure. And I won't be coy about it. I'll tell you more about it in a minute, because I hope that I can help some people who might be suffering from the same problem that I did, which was a problem that afflicts men of a certain age, which, whether I like it or not, I happen to be. The reason that I say I was naive is that this was an outpatient procedure, and the brochures that they give you and the lecture that you get from your doctor and so on emphasizes that this is a relatively low impact thing. And what I convinced myself of was that I would be back on my feet within a matter of, 24 to 48 hours. And so I didn't build in any time off, particularly for this program. And in retrospect, I don't know where I got that from, because even the propaganda says most people are back to normal activities within a week. I would like to meet those people because I don't think it happens. I've read a lot of testimony subsequently from people who had this procedure, and like me, they weren't having any fun after a week, certainly not after 24 to 48 hours. And I should have known from baseball that when anyone says, on average, well, some days Lou Gehrig goes 4 for 4, and some days he goes 0 for 4, and you don't know what you're going to get when you buy your ticket. And for me, now that I'm on almost exactly 21 days, I've definitely made progress, but an accurate prediction would have said you'll feel better in a month. Back in June, the New Yorker published a David Sedaris story about his partner Hugh undergoing hip replacement surgery, which is a famously punishing experience. And Sedaris, or the Sedaris character, feels put out because Hugh does all their cooking, and he, Sedaris, doesn't want to accept that that task will now fall to him. I'm sure there are people who recover from hip replacement in a matter of days. You just don't hear about them, he says. I wasn't that naive or that willfully naive, but I was close. And whereas it's not like I did no research before heading into this experience, it was only after that I discovered a Reddit board devoted to this great, supposedly easy, comfortable procedure in which virtually every poster said he regretted having it and was dealing with any of a number of dire after effects. I wouldn't characterize my own... Well, let me take that back. There were some kind of dire moments. As I said, I want to talk about this, but I figure that if some of you are squeamish or you don't want to have to explain this to your kid or the cat or that other long list of folks I said might be listening with you right now, you can just skip ahead a couple of minutes. As I said, I'm a middle-aged male, and like a lot of folks who fit that description, I've been suffering from an enlarged prostate for a while. For those of you who are new to the whole prostate experience, it is a part of the male reproductive system. It's a gland that produces semen, and while I am not going to describe the entire process of making a baby for you, what I do want to say is that, you know how sometimes religious extremists like to argue with evolution by saying parts of the body, such as the eye, are too complicated to have been produced over a period of thousands of years via natural selection? Do you think nature could just make a camera? There had to be someone designing that thing. There had to be an intelligent designer. That's pretty easily refuted, actually, and eyes are a great example of evolution because you start with a light-sensitive cell somewhere, and a creature that has some vague light sensitivity, and being partially blind, I can tell you that having some vague light perceptivity is a lot better than having none. And so the primitive critter that can see a tiny, tiny bit has a better chance of surviving and passing on its genes than one that can't see at all. And they get together and create offspring that can see a little bit better. And again, the ones that don't see as well, they are predated upon. They do not get to pass on their genes. And you kind of build upwards again over a process of years. But I will also point out that the body is full of examples of unintelligent design, specifically dual-use plumbing. If your air duct and your food intake were not located in the same place, there would never be a need for a Heimlich maneuver. Similarly, having one's reproductive and waste elimination system all jammed together in the same space and making use of the same passages is just pure laziness. One's bladder sits just above the prostate. The prostate hugs the tube leading out of the bladder, commonly called the urethra. This is fine when you're a young fellow and the prostate's only 20 or 25 grams, but as you get to be my age, there is the potential of a medical issue called benign prostate hyperplasia, BPH, meaning that the damn thing inexplicably gets bigger, as if you've exercised it too much. I've had a happy life that way, but not that happy. It just happens. It happened in a very severe way to my father, and so I always thought it likely that it would be a problem for me at some point in my life, and that point over the last, year, but probably longer, it has arrived. And when the thing gets larger, it starts to choke off your ability to eliminate liquid from your body. I don't know why they call it benign, since it's not benign at all, but I guess they're trying to differentiate between that prostate problem and prostate cancer, which of course can off you, which is yet another way that this completely hidden gland, there's another aspect of unintelligent design, that we have invisible parts and no dummy lights, no warning system, and with some things, by the time you say, ow, what is that? It's too late. If you just allow it to get worse and worse, this so-called benign issue can cause a lot of damage to you. First of all, because it damages the bladder, because essentially the bladder gets backed up and has to work twice as hard. And eventually it can just turn off the faucet altogether through closing that passage. And then you're in trouble. That's an ER visit. You know, there's a famous story that may or may not be true about the astronomer Tycho Brahe, that he died from some version of this, some version of his plumbing not being open enough. And he was at some formal event and he didn't want to get up to try to relieve himself, or he was unable to. And he became an overfilled water balloon and eventually just went That seems like a very unpleasant way to go. And unfortunately, because my poor late dad had so many illnesses that prevented him from receiving certain treatments for certain medical issues, he couldn't address this the way that I've been able to address this now. So he kind of got to that Tycho Brahe place a number of times. And there are artificial ways of plumbing that blockage, which, and I've just had some experience with that coming out of the surgery, are spectacularly uncomfortable, painful. There are also medications for this, but they're not a fix. They treat the symptoms, but not the problem. And ultimately, the gland itself has to be dealt with. Fortunately, there are a variety of options at that point, and all of them have downsides because there's a non-zero chance that the outcome will affect either your elimination or your sex life. And I've always liked both about how I had them prior to this episode. I prefer to keep enjoying them as I have enjoyed them. And so I chose a relatively new, by relatively new, I mean about 10, 15 years old, procedure that is supposed to have the least risk of harming things and the greatest chance of improving things without doing any damage. And it's been, as I said, about 3 weeks, and everything seems to be headed in the right direction, but I'm not back to normal either, mainly in the sense that it's been uncomfortable for me to sit here in front of my microphone for long periods of time. And I've been talking to you now for over 15 minutes, and I'm about at my limit. You won't know that because at some point I will pause and kind of move around a bit and reload, so to speak. Well, reload is probably a bad term in this context, but you get the idea. Limber up, give things a rest. I even have a special pillow and everything, but no matter what I do, the pressure is in all the wrong places. If you look at a diagram of the body, male or female, albeit the female one lacks that particular organ, they've got fun, problematic organs of their own, you'll see that everything is jammed up together. And I find it a wonder that anyone can ever sit down. I tell you, it's just unintelligent design. Some of this equipment should be like in a pack on your back or the equivalent thereof. And I tell you all of this because if you're a male of a certain age and you find yourself getting up a lot at night to go to the bathroom, because that's one aspect of how things start to change for us as we get past or into and past our 40s. A lot of people think that's an inevitable part of aging, but actually it may be an expression of this sort of problem. And the good thing about the timing of what I chose to do, being resolute about having to face it, is that you're only a candidate for this lower impact procedure that I had while your gland is under a certain size. Once you get to a Death Star proportion, they no longer can do that. They have to do something more radical and that has more risks to those systems that I just described. So time is of the essence. And let me say this much, that even though the aftermath was much more uncomfortable than I thought it would be, I have also stopped getting up to go to the bathroom approximately 29 times a night, which means that I rest better, and in some profound way, I feel better. And the doctors promise me that as things continue to heal and calm down, that I will just get to keep enjoying that without any of these other consequences that I've been experiencing. And it is getting better, as evidenced by the fact that, again, I have been speaking to you now for almost 18 minutes, and 3 weeks ago, I could not sit here at all, and 2 weeks ago, I could only sit here for a couple of minutes at a time before feeling like I needed to run away. And now I'm going to be able to progress through the program and have a conversation with you, which is, of course, the thing that I most look forward to doing every week. So look, whereas I don't apologize for taking care of my health in a way that I needed to, I do apologize for not understanding just what I was about to go through, and therefore not banking a bunch of mini episodes with more stories for you so that the experience, while painful for me, would not be painful for you. I don't ever want you to feel abandoned, and certainly one of the prime directives of podcasting is simply to be there. And as you know, I've tried very, very hard to keep the show on its regular Friday schedule going back a long time now, and it really broke my heart, among other pieces of me, that I was going to have to break the role that we were on together. And I really do hope that you understand. And just again, I don't want to dissuade anyone who might eventually need to consider this sort of procedure by saying that the aftermath was uncomfortable. Some people definitely have an easier time of it than I did. I just got lucky, I guess. And I do firmly believe that this was the right thing to do, and that in the long term, I will be very happy that I did it. Having said all that, it's time to move on to the second act of the show, and I need to ask your indulgence again, because the surgery, this was brilliant planning on my part, took place directly after the trading deadline, and my intention was to have a show out immediately thereafter that reflected on it. And since just before I heard the anesthesiologist say breathe deeply as he shoved a mask onto my face so hard that it actually cut me under the eyes, good old Brian Cashman traded for, among others, David Bednar, the Pirates closer. I thought I would review the long and colorful history of Yankees-Pirates trades with a few remarks thereupon. It's not the most, allegorical episode that I've ever done. It's certainly not the most political. It is just kind of baseball wonkiness, but I thought as a change of pace, you might enjoy that. And since sitting here has been a problem, I certainly haven't had time to research and write a whole new episode. And so I'm going to stick with what I had planned, a look back at 100 years of Pirates-Yankees swaps and see what conclusions we can draw from, a litany of good and bad, mostly bad, I would say, trades, but I suppose that depends on your point of view and which side of the equation you find yourself on, or at least which team you find yourself rooting for. So, finally, for the first time in 3 weeks, we will pause for this brief intermission, and on the other side, we will consider the art of team building or team deconstruction through the lens of New York and Pittsburgh. You've waited this long, so you'll wait till we get to the other side, won't you? I do thank you so much. So did you take a break during that brief intermission? I took a break. I promise my break was longer than your break, unless you went away for a day or a week or something. I haven't been gone that long, but I gave my body a chance to be comfortable with being all folded up here again, and I am ready and raring to go, and I hope you are as well. How often is one really raring in their life? Like, are you raring to go to McDonald's? Do you rare on a daily basis? Is that too personal a question? Because I'm not sure in what context we rare. I do want to say this much off topic. While I was gone, I was thinking about this. I said before the break that this is not one of those episodes of The Infinite Inning in which I'm trying to construct an elaborate analogy from baseball to our historical or current situation, our way of living today. As you know, we could do that. We could do that every week. Here's how Babe Ruth reacted to the 1932 presidential election, Herbert Hoover versus Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Here is how, and I returned to this subject at Baseball Prospectus fairly recently, here is how the 19th century outfielder Pete Browning was affected by living in a version of our culture in which destroying yourself was just something that one did, and it was kind of a private decision, and one was looked upon with judgment, but not necessarily empathy. And that was true until fairly recently, and we've told that story in a number of different ways, including with the tales of notable Giants pitchers Bugs Raymond and Shufflin' Phil Douglas. I feel like if you have to explain to people why letting someone drown in their own psychological problems is a poor leading indicator for society as a whole, if you have to explain why kicking the least and poorest among us while they're down suggests a meaner, crueler version of America for everyone, I feel like if you have to explain why the erosion of one person's rights eventually normalizes the erosion of everyone's rights, then you've already lost. Right before I came on here, I was looking at an essay by the author Clint Smith in The Atlantic called Actually, Slavery Was Very Bad. Clint Smith wrote a tremendous book a couple of years ago called How the Story is Told, which is about the remembrance of slavery in this country. And he was reacting in this essay to our current elected leader's Truth Social post decrying the Smithsonian Institution's emphasis on slavery being bad. You know, the Smithsonian is a very large operation, and a lot of it just emphasizes pandas or dinosaur skeletons. And if you walk into the National Museum of American History, which has always been a weirdly disjointed, disorganized experience, the first thing you see actually is the Star-Spangled Banner, the flag, the literal flag that flew over Fort McHenry during a bombardment of the fort by British ships during the War of 1812. That was observed by a lawyer, Francis Scott Key, and it inspired him to write the poem that became our national anthem. The anthem itself is just his set of verses set to an English drinking song. And Francis Scott Key was a slaveholder, and a lot of the inspiration for the War of 1812 was not, as we are often taught, about British interference with American shipping. The East Coast states were against the War of 1812, and some argued they should secede rather than participate in it. It was the Western states agitating for that, and it was because the British were propping up the Native Americans on the frontier, and the Western states wanted to steamroller those guys, but they weren't free to do it. Does the Smithsonian give you that information, that background? Hell no. They just, every 15 minutes, drop a protective scrim on the thing because it's rather fragile. And they play a snippet of that drinking song, which always makes me want to shout, "Play ball!" as it gets to the end. That's its main use. Its main use is to signify that a ball game is about to begin. And then the scrim goes back up, and it's not quite so bad that you exit through the gift shop at that point, but you go on to the rest of the museum, which has incredibly challenging exhibits on American history, like here are all the gowns the First Ladies wore at their inaugural balls. Over the years I have gone there, I have seen exhibits on Superman and the Peanuts comic strip. I have seen exhibits on MASH when MASH went away. That was a long time ago. I'm not sure if they still have this vitrine out there, this cabinet, which has a whole lot of television artifacts in it, which probably mean increasingly little to visitors as time goes on. But it had Howdy Doody in it, and the Fonz's jacket, and the roster board from Barney Miller and Archie Bunker's chair, and so on. They had poor Kermit the Frog there under glass for a long time, orphaned by his father far too early in life. I remember going there in the mid-'80s and seeing one of the cars from Blade Runner as part of an exhibit on design. I remember taking my kids there some years ago and seeing one of the Michael Keaton-era Batmobiles. Have I mentioned slavery yet? No, because it ain't there. They've got ancient dynamos and train engines and mock-ups of pharmacies from the 1880s and musical instruments from 150 years ago, but in no way is slavery centered. It's safer for them that way, but what there is now is a National Museum of African American History and Culture, and our leader objects to that museum focusing on slavery and Jim Crow and so on as central to the experience of those Americans. As if any American history that doesn't start with the Pilgrims and just sort of blanketly, is that an adverb? Blankets all of us with that single story. Every other version of it is illegitimate. But of course, that's the real story of freedom, that in every generation we've expanded the definition of who it applies to. It's a tug of war that's been fought over 300 plus years. It's not just given, sometimes it's taken or demanded, and eventually, sometimes, it wins out. And so this is paradoxical, but in a sense, slavery and segregation are both the greatest crime in American history, the central story of American history. But the fact that we do build memorials to it, that we do acknowledge it, that we put the manacles and the chains in museums and say, never again, we were wrong, but we know better now, that is our crowning glory. The problem for some, of course, is they don't like to ever acknowledge that the country is flawed. If you say that our freedom, our story is incomplete, then it opens you to being asked, what else can we do? How do we further promote? How do we further expand the story of democracy and freedom. And of course, they perceive it as one person's increased freedom means another person's lessened freedom. One person's increased share of the national economic pie means another person's decreased share, even if they are still going to be ungodly wealthy once all is said and done. That's a very selfish and narrow way of looking at it. And it's just kind of primitivism, and it wears a lot of costumes over the thousands of years of human history. But, going back to when some human beings decided, we're not going to be hunter-gatherers anymore. We're not going to wander through the woods and the fields chasing bison or pulling sour apples off of trees. We're going to plant wheat, okay? There were some humans who said, you do that. We prefer the hunting bison lifestyle. We kind of like those sour apples. And there were others who said, look at those morons over there sitting on that one patch of dirt and making themselves vulnerable. They got one thing right. Let's not hunt bison anymore. The bison fight back sometimes. Let's hunt them. And as soon as they've taken that wheat and smashed it into flour and therefore bread, let's just go take it. Ever see the movie The Magnificent Seven, the original with Yul Brynner? So those primitive humans, they do what the characters in that movie did. They hire cops, essentially, to fight off the former bison guys, now turned predators, turned rustlers or thieves. And they pass laws, and they create stone tablets that say, thou shalt not bonk the wheat farmer on the head and steal the fruit of his labor. And so the former bison hunters, now land pirates, now terrorists, they get together and they say, okay, you know what? You're right about that, Mr. Farmer. That was wrong of us. But what if the wheat farmer in question was black? What if he were Jewish? What if he were gay? What if he were all three? What if he were a woman? Then it would be okay, right? And the wheat farmers look at themselves and they say, none of us answer to any of those categories, right? And so I guess it's okay. It still feels a little awkward, though. And the wheat pirates, they say, well, wait, we've got scripture. Our greatest priests have talked to the Almighty, and he says that those groups, it's okay to bonk them on the head and steal their stuff because they're not all right. They are failed experiments. They are unholy. They are unclean. And the wheat farmers say, well, yeah, that we buy that, but not all of us are religious. Some of us are more into scientific validation. And the wheat pirates, they come back and they say, well, we've got that too. We made a chart and we've classified everyone and everything from the smallest ant to the greatest ape. And we've set up a hierarchy of humans in it according to the latest data. And you can see that white male Europeans, they are the ne plus ultra of the animal kingdom, and all those other groups we mentioned, they're down here below the ants. It's weird, but it's true. You can't dispute it. It's science. And the weak guys say, great. So let's set up some lunch counters and we'll tell those other guys that they can't come in. Time goes by and everyone forgets because it becomes habitual to believe these things, because some people teach others that these things are indisputably true, and it just becomes second nature to know it. And then the process of unlearning becomes such a heavy lift. Thinking about it, I just talked about lunch counters. One aspect of this history that you can see at the National Museum of American History, at least I assume that the Fuhrer has not pulled it out yet, is a lunch counter which once resided. It's the literal counter and 4 chairs that once resided in a Greensboro, North Carolina Woolworth. I haven't heard it mentioned by our leadership yet, but they'll get around to it. Here's what the Smithsonian website says beneath a picture of that lunch counter. Tell me where the lie is. It says, racial segregation was still legal in the United States on February 1st, 1960, when 4 African-American college students sat down at this Woolworth counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. Politely asking for service at this whites-only counter, their request was refused. When asked to leave, they remained in their seats. Their sit-in drew national attention and helped ignite a youth-led movement to challenge inequality throughout the South. In Greensboro, hundreds of students, civil rights organizations, churches, and members of the community joined in a 6-month-long protest. Their commitment ultimately led to the desegregation of the F.W. Woolworth lunch counter on July 25th, 1960. Ezell A. Blair Jr., now Jabril Kazan, Franklin E. McCain, Joseph A. McNeil, and David L. Richmond were students enrolled at the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College when they began their protest. Protests such as this led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which finally outlawed racial segregation in public accommodations. Again, where is the lie? Where is the thing that's inaccurate? And again, there is our glorious history of first ladies wearing expensive dresses and the Star-Spangled Banner. If this is not the kind of American history that you're willing to learn about, they have Ike jacket, Eisenhower jacket. I guess they called them Eisenhower jackets. He was a smaller guy than I thought. And of course, the Batmobile, our greatest crime fighter of all time, beating up on poor people, billionaire beating up on poor people. I love Batman, but it's true. It's been gone for a long time now, but they used to have an old-fashioned ice cream parlor downstairs. That was a lot of fun. And so, as with every place you go to, whether it's a National Museum or a Cracker Barrel, you can see what you want to see and experience it the way you want to experience it and disregard what you don't like or refuse to learn from it or painfully squeeze your eyes shut when it offends you. But to demand that what you don't like be erased is a very sinister kind of thinking, because you're erasing evidence of a crime. You're erasing knowledge that it was a crime. You're erasing, yes, the very legitimate guilt that one inherits as part of being a claimant to the entire American pageant, all the good stuff, all those Thanksgiving turkeys were sorry turkeys. Every syllable of we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. You get the other stuff too as part of the package. And learning to hold contradictory thoughts in your head, whether about your mom or about your country. We are really great, but we let you down sometimes. We try really hard to do the right thing, but we're also disappointing. And sometimes we fail. Every single human being you've ever met answers to those terms, and so does every single country. And in that same way, and I think I've used this example before, France, for example, gets liberty, fraternity, egalite. I think I've got the order wrong there, but you get my point. And they also get the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre. And I can get up from this chair right now and pull out any of a half dozen books on the Vietnam War from my shelves and point out pictures of French soldiers happily standing next to the decapitated bodies of Vietnamese citizens who used to be part of their empire. So again, to come full circle, and I know I've been trying to do that for a while, and I apologize if I've been overly discursive, but to come back to Mr. Smith's essay, if you're in the position of having to explain to people who might not have studied it as much as you have, slavery was actually really bad, then you're in a dire place to begin with. The unlearning has happened. It's the same thing as with the Holocaust. We can say the Holocaust and it's just a sound that comes out of our mouths. And we can even read about it lightly. And gee, it sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? But when you get into it on a granular level in the day-to-day experience of people living under that kind of terror, it was worse than anything you can possibly imagine. Try to personalize it. Try to imagine it and personalize it if you've never done that before. Imagine saying to yourself, pick any age of your life. If you're me, you're a parent, you're an adult. And you say, well, here's my life as I am living it. Every morning, the alarm clock goes off. I have some coffee, maybe I have some eggs, and then I get to work. But the boots, the brown shirts, they showed up at my door today. I was told that I have to move, and all my family. Likewise, my children have already been collected. My life as I knew it for the last half century is permanently over. When and if I return to this spot, should I be so fortunate as to survive, I will find that all my goods have been sold and that my house is owned by someone else who bought it at auction for $1. We have been allowed to pack a few socks and a couple of other precious items, and now we are being loaded onto a train. We got off after a very harrowing train journey. At the platform, they separated my wife and daughter from myself and my son. I never saw them again. I learned after it was all over that they were immediately gassed. My elderly parents, who went out on a prior train and I thought would be waiting for us here, are also already dead. I never got to say goodbye. And I'm going to stop here because this is too painful for me to do. And because I know people who experienced this, relatives of mine who did not live to tell the tale, and people who I met who did. Did they have normal days after that, having survived it? Yeah, not many. And I would say that every moment of their lives were, in some sense, inflected by the terror. But I am sincerely asking you to find some quiet space in the days of your life, some 5 minutes somewhere, maybe in the dark, maybe before you fall asleep one night. Personalize it. Try to live it in your mind. And if that doesn't work for you, then try the American version, which means being a Native American at Sand Creek, or being a Union soldier of color at Fort Pillow, or simply being on an auction block in Baltimore or Washington or New Orleans or Natchez, and having your child pulled out of your arms so some stranger can squeeze your thighs and inspect your teeth preliminary to buying you. And then you are sent to God knows where, and you never see your children again. And in that time, by the way, a firm cap has been placed on your lifespan, firmer than whatever the actuarial tables of the time would have said that your lifespan would have been, because you are about to be worked to death. That is as much America as the invention of the telegraph or the steam engine or the light bulb, or the fact that we won the Battle of the Bulge, and the immigrant stories, one way or another, of Hans Wagner and Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Jolton Joe DiMaggio. We need to know both things. We need to be able to say or think simultaneously, I want to be, as Casey Stengel said, someone for the United States. I want to write things as elevating of the cause of freedom as Thomas Jefferson did, but hell no do I want to be like Thomas Jefferson, a rapey slaveholder. We need to have both in our memories. We need to know that when the umpire does say, play ball, at the end of the Star-Spangled Banner, that the invitation was at one time not open to anyone who wanted to play, but it is today. And that's a great thing. And to acknowledge that it once wasn't true is to be proud of our country, because now it is. The latter without the former is meaningless. It's just jingoism. It's just pride in a thing because you're told to be proud of it. Did you ever have a really hard course in school, and in the first quarter you got a D or an F, and you said to yourself or your folks, look, I underestimated how hard that was going to be. I admit I didn't study enough, but I am going to buckle down and work at it, and next quarter I'm going to get an A, and then you do. That's the story of humanity at its best, and of course it's the story of the United States of America. And it's the story of baseball, too. So what do you say? I told you, I promised that we would just do some fun baseball trades. Can we do that now? Let's take one more break. And on the other side, let's look at those Yankees-Pirates trades, okay? And we'll talk a lot of stuff that's kind of limited to cleats for the most part. But even when you do want to get that A, you do take a break from studying every now and again, don't you? Can I do the theme song wind-up that I do on the reissue episodes? I kind of enjoy that version. In this case, it's signifying, okay, we're turning the baseball engine back on. So buckle up, horsehide time travelers. So as someone who has spent a lot of his life professionally, geographically in proximity to the Yankees, I'm always interested in what they do at the trading deadline. It is incumbent upon me, both as the kind of baseball fan and writer that I am, to be curious about what everyone does about everything all the time. But I am especially engaged with their history. So at the trading deadline, General Manager Brian Cashman went on a shopping spree. He attempted to solve the team's third base problem, which should have been approached over the winter, with Ryan McMahon of the Rockies, who has fielded well, but has not hit as we should not have expected him to hit. He picked up some right-handed platoon guys, Ahmed Rosario, who got hurt, Austin Slater, who got hurt, and Jose Caballero, who actually has played very well in a small sample, hitting way over what he typically does. Maybe they unlocked something special in Jose Caballero. He's already hit 2 home runs and has stolen 6 bases in 7 attempts, so he has worked out tremendously well. On the pitching side, however, they acquired David Bednar, the closer from the Pirates, Camilo Doval, the defrocked closer from the Giants, and Jake Bird, who had been a setup man for the Rockies. That has worked out so well. Bird is already in the minor leagues. Doval, who has always struggled with his control, has walked 9 guys per 9, roughly, in a, again, small sample, with New York, and Bednar has been okay. It took them a while to figure out that they needed to send Devin Williams as far back into the bullpen as they could without having him actually leave the stadium. Arguably, Devin Williams has done more damage to his free agency case, and he is heading into free agency, as any player in baseball this year who has been healthy throughout the campaign. Unfortunately, Bednar has pitched in 8 games for New York. As I say these words, he has had 6 save opportunities. He has converted 3 and blown 3, and that is not acceptable, not when the standard saves conversion rate is something like 85%. And you know the reason why. It's because a competent pitcher can usually get 3 outs before he gives up 3 runs. That's how Joe Borowski once led the American League in saves with an ERA of 5.07. I alluded to this on a recent episode when I noted a Blue Jays position player throwing 35 to 65 miles per hour, giving up only 2 runs while getting 3 outs. Baseball is that hard. If he had come in with a 3-run lead, he would have been credited with a save. Baseball is a tough game, and most of the time, even a below-average pitcher can get 3 outs before he gives up 3 runs. Now, having said that, I've really enjoyed Bednar's story this season in that he had some really rough spells in 2024 and finished with an ugly line of 5.77 ERA after putting up a 2.25 ERA in about 180 innings over the prior 3 years. He began this season getting shellacked in April, and I thought, well, something's broken, maybe permanently, because the story of most relievers, the vast majority of them, is inconsistency. The Pirates sent him down, this 28-year-old who had led the National League in saves in 2023, and I suppose it was a mechanical issue that they correctly diagnosed, or he did, because he got better. In the 37 innings he pitched, between coming back up and being traded to New York, he allowed only 7 earned runs, 8 walks, 50 strikeouts. That's a 1.70 ERA. And the Yankees needed him to solve a problem, given that, as I already said, Williams has pitched like a 2-cup of coffee a day man after his 3rd cup. It's still too early to say whether that will be the case or not, but so far, it hasn't been so great. For me, the odd thing was that was what I expected as soon as I heard Yankees-Pirates trade. I thought, this isn't going to end well. I don't know why I thought that. It took unpacking the entire litany of trades between the two clubs to figure out why. And so, a review. Here is what I found. The first trade between the Yankees and the Pirates came in 1915 when New York bought Dazzy Vance. Yes, a future Hall of Famer, one of the all-time great strikeout pitchers. Unfortunately, the Dazzler was then 24, had a bad arm, wasn't dazzling anyone. It was only 7 years later, after having some sort of surgery, it's not clear what kind, that he became one of the greats. The Yankees had long since dumped him at that time, and of course he went on to glory with the Brooklyn Dodgers, who received him as a throw-in on a trade on essentially a 3rd catcher. The Yankees missed out again in 1937 when they sold right-hander Jim Tobin of Tobin's Spirit Guide fame to the Pirates. Tobin was still only 24, and like Vance, he had some injuries going that kept him from blossoming. It was only later with the Braves that he started throwing a knuckleball and had some consistent success. If you ever see his name, it's because he once hit 3 homers in a game against the Cubs. These are not things the Yankees could have predicted, but still were 0 for 2. In the fall of 1946, the Yankees traded Tiny Bonham, the control pitcher whose death inspired the name of this podcast. They received lefty Arthur Cookie Cucurullo, who never pitched for them. Meanwhile, Bonham had about a season and a half left in the tank, and then, sadly, he passed away late in the 1949 season. Here's a deep cut I find fascinating. In February 1973, the Yankees traded the rare prospect from American Samoa. In fact, I think the only prospect from American Samoa, Tony Solita, who was 25 at the time, to the Pirates, of course, to the Pirates. All of these involve the Pirates. And they received a 32-year-old first baseman who was a 14-year minor league veteran named George Kopaz, who was never going to play for them. They just needed filler at AAA. There was some strange disregard in the Yankees organization for a player who seems to have been, he would later prove it, to have been a real prospect. Back in 1968, Solita had been the MVP of the Class A Carolina League with a 3.02 .434, .672 season. 42 home runs and 113 walks are in there. He also struck out 112 times, which probably seemed like a ton back then, and the Yankees just kept sending him back out, even after he played well at the higher levels, if not to the level of the Carolina League MVP season, and then finally they just gave him away. He then hit well for the Pirates at AAA, but they left him there. They failed to protect him in the Rule 5 draft, and off he went to the Royals. And to jump ahead a little bit, he spent about a half dozen seasons as a platoon bat in the majors, and he hit .255 with a .357 on-base percentage, a .421 slugging percentage, which is not bad at all for the 1970s. It works out to a .120 OPS plus. Following that, he went off to Japan, and he slugged 155 home runs in 4 seasons with the Nippon Ham Fighters. And indeed, the Fighters fought their war against Ham and won it. He didn't necessarily have a great time there, because at that time, the Japanese baseball players or baseball leagues weren't great at making foreign-born players feel welcome. He went home to Samoa, revived Little League Baseball there, put this guy in the Hall of Fame. Unfortunately, he was murdered there in a property dispute, apparently, at the age of 43. And far less significantly, before anyone writes me, yes, I know that the team is the Nippon Ham Fighters, that Nippon Ham sponsors the club. They are not the Nippon Ham Fighters. I just enjoy thinking of them that way. Not that I have anything against the Hams. What have the Hams done to me? Live and let live, I say to the Hams. Now here's a good trade for the Yankees, a great trade, one of the best trades in team history, and one of the worst, conversely, in Pirates history. In 1975, do you know where this one's going already? They sent starting pitcher Doc Meddick, to that point 49-40 with a 3.40 ERA in his career, out to Pittsburgh in return for pitchers Doc Ellis and Ken Brett and a young second baseman named Willie Randolph, an unrecognized great of the second base game. Meddick flopped in 1976, and the joke around Pittsburgh was that Ellis was even a better doctor than he was. The Pirates, I guess, thought that Rennie Stennett was going to play for them forever, but first of all, Rennie Stennett was only a so-so player, really. Second, he got very badly hurt and was never the same guy. And I guess the next not great, but good second baseman that they came up with was Johnny Ray. Baseball Reference has Willie Randolph at about 67 career wins above replacement. By the way, he'll never go into the Hall of Fame, but I watched him every day growing up, and I can tell you that the stats don't wholly tell the story of how good he was. Now we have to talk about a Pirates-Yankees trade that didn't happen. First baseman Jason Thompson played in the majors from 1976 through 1986. He wasn't the most consistent guy. He hit only .261 for his career, but he had walks, he had power, so he was very productive anyway. He wasn't a great fielder, he wasn't fast, left-handed pitching gave him problems, but he did have 3 all-star campaigns when he did things like hit .284 with a .391 on base and slug .511 with 31 homers and 101 walks, my favorite kind of player. He did that for the 1982 Pirates. The thing was, he shouldn't have been there. He was supposed to have that season in pinstripes. Now, Thompson had come up with the Pirates and had great hitting seasons for them in 1977 and 1978. He slumped in 79, and when that dragged into 1980, the Tigers sent him to the California Angels for outfielder Al Cowens. He recovered his stroke in Anaheim. He hit .317, .439, .526 in 102 games. Those are your lottery numbers for today. The problem, from the Angels' point of view, is that they already had Rod Carew playing first base, and they wanted to DH Don Baylor, so there was no room at the inn for Jim. In April of 1981, the Pirates and the Yankees, worked out a 3-way deal. The Angels sent Thompson to the Pirates for catcher Ed Ott, a 29-year-old non-hitter, and Mickey Mahler, a 28-year-old lefty swingman who had a .550 career ERA. And all there is to say about that is that the next good general manager that the Angels have is probably also the first good general manager that they've had. The Pirates then sent Thompson on to the Yankees for veteran first baseman Jim Spencer, a minor league pitcher named Greg Cochran, another then minor league pitcher named Fred Tolliver, and a cool $850,000. The Pirates wanted Spencer, a Gold Glover at first, but one who seldom hit, because they had the 41-year-old Willie Stargell playing first base, and to borrow from Mel Brooks and Madeline Kahn, everything below the waist was kaput. The Yankees wanted Spencer gone because he was irritating. They had somehow consented to a clause in his contract that said that if there were a right-handed pitcher on the mound, he had to play. It wasn't up to the manager, and he insisted that clause be honored too. They were surprised. A little over half the money going to the Pirates was meant to cover his salary. Unfortunately, that payment triggered the commissioner of baseball. A few years earlier, Charlie Finley, then the A's owner, had realized he was not going to re-sign the players he was going to lose when free agency started, both because he was cheap and because they hated his guts. And so he sold Vita Blue to the Yankees and Joe Rudy and Raleigh Fingers to the Red Sox. Commissioner Bowie Kuhn vetoed those trades and proclaimed an arbitrary ceiling of $400,000 in any deal. Anything over that had to be, as Rod Serling would say, submitted for his approval. Well, he looked at the Yankees, Pirates, Angels trade and disapproved. So the Pirates and the Yankees restructured their side of things. This time, the Yankees were supposed to receive Thompson and 6 minor leaguers. Everything else was the same, with the exception that the avowed purpose of the $450,000 component was supposed to be for the purchase of those kids, not as a payment. The commissioner said no, and this was not the only time he did this. He looked at the prospects involved as if he were writing for, well, us at BP, and said, no, I don't think those prospects are good enough. They're not worth $450,000. You're just trying to circumvent me. The Pirates then made a third offer. Forget the cash and give us righty pitching prospect Gene Nelson. At that point, the Yankees walked away. It just got to be too much, George Steinbrenner said. It meant stripping myself of a player I consider my future, meaning Gene Nelson, who you might recall as a kind of setup reliever on some good A's teams in the 1980s. A year later, Steinbrenner sent his future to Seattle for Shane Raleigh. They never did get Thompson. On the other hand, Thompson wasn't in Don Mattingly's way a couple of years later, so you win some, you lose some. We jump forward another few years to another great trade for the Yankees, one I won't dwell on because we discussed it quite a bit on a recent episode of this podcast. The Yankees sent corner outfielder Steve Kemp and infielder Tim Foley and got back 3 players, one of whom was Jay Buhner. I will add that Kemp had been a really good hitter for the Tigers and White Sox from 1977 through 1982, hitting .284 with a .377 on base and a .446 slugging percentage. Remember when, Michael Conforto was good? He was kind of like that. The Yankees signed him as a free agent, giving him a 5-year contract in December 1982, by the way, forfeiting the 13th overall pick in the draft. Allow me to indulge in a gratuitous amount of hindsight here. The White Sox used that pick on a high school right-hander, Joel Davis, who did make it to the majors, but not really for anything he did in the minors. It seems like they were just trying to justify the pick. Roger Clemens was right there. He went to the Red Sox with the 19th pick. Again, totally unfair hindsight on my part, so take that for what it's worth. Kemp was very disappointing in his first season in New York. He scuffled for all but a little burst of life in June, and by late August, he'd be benched for the rookie I just mentioned, Don Mattingly. But there was also a tragic accident involved. On September 8th, he took, of all people, an Omar Moreno line drive. That's another Pirate, by the way, former Pirate at that point. He took an Omar Moreno line drive to the face during batting practice. He suffered a fractured cheekbone, 2 broken teeth, and damage to his left eye. He never lost consciousness, and after, he said he remembered lying on the grass and joking that he hoped the ball had hit him in the nose, because then he could get a nose job. But as he saw the expressions of the other players standing above him, he thought, it must be bad. At that point, the pitcher Rudy May came over, looked down at him and said, "Oh my God." And Kemp thought, it is bad. At first, all he had left in his eye was light sensitivity. Remember I mentioned that at the beginning of the show? He played part-time in 1984. He hit .291, but his power was gone. He was only 29, and he never did get back to where he was, or really anything close to that. We go from there to one of the worst Yankees trades of all time, with future NL Cy Young Award winner Doug Drabek dealt to the Pirates with relievers Logan Easley and Brian Fisher for starting pitcher Rick Rhoden and relievers Pat Clements and Cecilio, you're breaking my heart, Guante. I was actually a Rick Rhoden fan because he was such a good hitter by pitching standards, but gosh, like every other Yankees pitcher at the time, he was 34, he didn't throw hard, and he had a lot of mileage on his arm. They picked him up coming off a 250-inning season as well, and here is a recommendation to, say, that future good general manager the Angels are going to theoretically one day hire. Don't do that. I realize we don't let pitchers throw 250 innings anymore, so whatever the nearest reasonable facsimile is, whatever the current ceiling is, it's like buying a used car from a little old lady who only drove it every day, all day from here to Betelgeuse. Guante, who I've discussed before, was superficially successful but had some spectacular blown saves in key games, especially June 20th and June 21st, 1988 at Detroit, when he allowed walk-off home runs in back-to-back games, one of them an Alan Trammell grand slam I will never forget. We're almost back to the present day and thus the conclusion of this discussion, but I am obligated to take a final break this episode, so let's pause one last time, and on the other side we'll get yet closer to the present day and conclude an actual infinite inning episode, our first in 3 weeks, and I'm kind of excited because I didn't require hospitalization or anything. Knock wood. Let's not jinx that. One last Yankees-Pirates trade from the 1980s to discuss just barely made it in under the cut before the decade changed. In December 1989, the Yankees sent catcher Don Sluggo Slaught up to Pittsburgh for 2 fungible pitchers. Up, out, out to Pittsburgh. Slaught wasn't the greatest defensive backstop in the world, but he was a very effective hitter, particularly against left-handed pitching. In 6 seasons with the Pirates, he hit .305 with a .370 on base and a .421 slugging percentage, and played in 3 postseason series, which was 3 more than the Yankees played at that time. And now we're going to get into the Brian Cashman era. Here's a pretty bad trade. In June 2001, he sent lefty pitching prospect Damaso Marte, who was tearing it up in the minors, to Pittsburgh for no-field, no-hit utility guy Enrique Wilson. Marte was always wild, but he was wild in a productive way. He threw pitches that tended to dart out of the strike zone, but batters chased them, or most batters did. So even though he did walk some guys, he was often effective. From 2002 to 2007, he pitched to a .288 ERA with the White Sox and Pirates. This is as a setup-type reliever. Over the course of his career, good years and bad, he held left-handed hitters to 195, 289, 286 averages. Cashman then spent a number of years trying to get him back and did so in a 2008 trade that also brought Xavier Nady, but both of them were pretty much washed up by then. If I recall correctly, Marte was about to suffer a torn labrum. That's pretty much that a lot of the time. Scott Brocious, then the starting third baseman, suffered a broken hand on a hit by pitch. He was due to miss 6 weeks, and Cashman overreacted by overpaying for Wilson. He also sent 2 pitchers to the Rangers for Randy Velarde, a very good player at times, but one who was 39 and had nothing left to give. In related news, and this makes me feel old, almost as old as my prostate makes me feel, Randy Velarde is now 62 years old, and I feel like it was just yesterday that I heard Bob Shepard saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, your attention please. Now batting, number 18, Randy Velarde, number 18. Did you hear that crowd get up for Randy Velarde? They sure loved their Randy Velarde in New York back then. True story, one of my best, closest, oldest friends who worked for the Yankees for a time, you've heard me mention him often, he had Bob Shepard record his wedding announcements, his wedding introduction, when he got married. If I had thought of that sort of thing when I got married, I might have tried for Stan Lee. Then again, you know, they have a rule at Disneyland, Disney World. You can get married in those places, but they will not let Mickey Mouse give you away or officiate the thing, because when your spouse turns out to be a nasty cheater, they really don't want people going around saying, "And damn that Mickey Mouse for not warning me off of that son of a bitch." And that's why it's best not to involve your heroes or even favorite imaginary characters in your personal affairs. In February 2012, Cashman, continuing to make trades with the Pirates, sent A.J. Burnett, who had had a very up-and-down 3 years in New York, to the Pirates for 2 minor leaguers, one of whom didn't make it, one of whom was up for about half a second. Burnett pitched well for the Pirates. He had a 3.41 ERA over the final 2 years of his contract. Catcher Francisco Cervelli was sort of slot-like. He was somewhat overqualified as a backup catcher, but he had an unfortunate tendency towards concussions. In 2013 and 2014, he hit a nice 293, 372, 449 in 66 games for the Yankees. At that point, Cashman traded him for lefty reliever Justin Wilson, who is still out there pitching well. He had a good year in New York in 2015, and Cashman sent him on to the Tigers for Chad Green and Luis Cessa. Cervelli spent 5 years with Pittsburgh and hit 264, 362, 374. Not at all bad for a catcher, but of course, he did have those problems with getting hurt. In 2 of the 4 years, he was even better than that, so the averages don't tell the full story. Green was very good for the Yankees for most of a 7-year run with the club. And now we have just 3 trades of significance left to discuss. One I can sort of complain about, one I can't, and one was a pretty big win for the Yankees. The first involved trading out the league average pitcher, or league average-ish pitcher, Ivan Nova, who always reminds me of a character from Babylon 5. But putting that aside, Nova, who also reminds me of, well, Bagels, wasn't all that, but he was an established pitcher, and he was dealt out for an outfield prospect who never made it, and a reliever, Stephen Tarpley, who never established himself in the big leagues. Again, I'm not saying that moving Nova was the same as trading Whitey Ford in 1955, but he had some value at the 4th starter level. So there's an opportunity cost when you miss a shot like that. In 2021, Cashman sent 4 prospects to the Pirates for Jameson Taillon and got 2 decent years out of him, whereas the 4 players never paid off. Though one of them, pitcher Ronzi Contreras, seemed like he might become a good starter for a minute. That proved to be a flash in the pan. Finally, on July 26th, 2021, the Yankees sent Diego Castillo and Hoy Park to the Pirates for Clay Holmes. And I know Holmes could be exasperating at times. He's still that way now that he's starting for the Mets. Yet they gave away 2 players who proved to be of little import for one of the best ground ball pitchers in the game, one who gave up all of 10 home runs in 220 games with the Yankees despite the silly plastic park in which they play, and had a 2.69 ERA in those years. Yes, he blew the odd save, but look at what they've got now. All they do is blow saves. And so, as The Who sang, we call that a bargain, the best they ever had. Maybe not the best, but it's not bad either. I suppose there's no real takeaway here, except that if at first you don't succeed, try again. Brian Cashman is still a young man, and he has time to get it right. Maybe don't try for so many ex-Rockies, but there have been some good Pirates liberated for greater purposes than selling beer and playing exhibitions out there in western Pennsylvania. I suppose that's a mitzvah, even or especially when you don't get the best of the deal. We have come to the end of another episode. I thank you for waiting for me to get better. I'm still not all the way there, as I said, but regular service should resume without interruption at this point. And to all of you who wrote me and said, take care of yourself before you take care of the podcast, I thank you so much for your generosity. Should anyone else wish to write me, they can do so at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And should they wish to follow me on social media, they can do so at stephengoldman.bsky.social. I've been quiet while I've been recovering, but I'm limbering up again. A Facebook group remains. Simply go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning, bang, you're there. Posting will resume at this time as well, but I am planning on terminating the thing. Really, I'm not just the boy who cried terminating Facebook. Should you wish to support the show, however, and I very much hope you do, please visit patreon.com/theinfiniteinning, gear of a rudimentary kind, available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do that, look up what I said about below-the-waist health. It's important. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who says, "Why didn't you do a whole episode about my surgery? I had my tonsils out and you didn't say nothing." Oh, Sorry, Rick, that was a long time ago and podcasting hadn't been invented yet. I promise if it had been, well, I better cut myself off there and just say, if I can manage to stay away from the surgeon's knife and the butcher's cleaver, I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the infinite inning.